Good morning, everyone. All right, today we're going to continue with the Cold War. Part 6, we're going to go to the height of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's going to reach its highest point from 1960 to 1962. Coincidentally, just coinciding with the period when I was born in December of 1959. So I'm going to be a baby through all of this. So I'm not going to really remember it, but this is the period we're going into. This here, we see a photograph here. This is actually the checkpoint between East and West Berlin, known as Checkpoint Charlie. We'll talk about this later. Now, the first event of the heightening of the Cold War is called the U-2 incident. The CIA was spying on the USSR by flying high-altitude planes called the U-2 plane. You see a photograph of one here. And they would fly over the Soviet Union and photograph military bases. Now, in 1960, the Soviets actually shoot one down. It was over the Soviet Union. Now, the planes flew at 15 miles above the Earth, so they pretty much thought they were, immune from anything the Soviets had. But unfortunately, they did get some rockets, and they were able to shoot the plane down. Here we see the pilot, Gary Powers, with the U-2 plane. Since they were 15 miles up, you could see there was pretty much a flight suit they would have to wear, similar to almost like what astronauts would use. Now, Eisenhower originally denied it was a spy plane, and he created this lie that he was told to say that it was a weather plane that had crashed. But the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, photographed here, survived, along with photos of the Russian bases he had taken. He was under orders to commit suicide and then blow the plane up as it was coming down, but he wasn't able to do that. So the Russians had him and the plane. The whole lie fell apart, and it really embarrassed the Eisenhower administration. Now, Powers was actually put on trial for spying, and he was sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison. He only served 2 years before he was exchanged for a captured Soviet spy, Rudolf Abel, who was captured in New York City and was convicted of spying on the United States. And in a very famous incident, they were brought to a bridge that borders between East Germany and West Germany, and the pilot, Powers, and the spy Abel were actually exchanged. This was dramatized in the 2015 Tom Hanks movie, Bridge of Spies. It's an excellent movie, very good Cold War movie. I don't know if it's on Netflix, but it's really worth seeing. Okay, let's move on. Now we're going to move into the next event, the Berlin Wall. Everyone's pretty much heard about the Berlin Wall, but this is the start of it. Now, after the Bay of Pigs, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. This was an incident that occurred in Cuba, so we're going to talk about when we get to Cuba. Now, in 1960, Eisenhower is done after his 2 terms as president, his 8 years, and we have a new president, John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment he inherited as soon as he came in, he was determined to respond to growing communist threats. Now, the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, he wanted control of West Berlin. He attempted to get it by cutting off West Berlin. If you remember back in 1948, that failed due to the Berlin airlift. Since then, many East Germans were escaping to the west through Berlin. All they had to do was walk to the other side, across the street. They could then get on an airliner, fly to West Berlin, and now they've managed to escape. So this is going on too, and this is really annoying the East German and also the Soviet governments. Now, Kennedy is going to meet with Khrushchev. They meet in June of 1961. They go to Vienna, but it doesn't go very well. This was the first summit meeting between the two, and Kennedy had a lot of health problems, including a bad back, and it really caused problems, and he didn't come off looking very good. And Khrushchev felt that he could take advantage of this young president. So he makes a demand for West Berlin. Kennedy, of course, says no, and he, like Truman earlier, he's not going to back down and allow West Berlin to be taken over by East Germany. Now, Khrushchev responds to this by building a wall through Berlin and around, all around the border of East Germany and West Germany. So basically cutting everyone off. Now, in the beginning, we're going to see a picture come up here. It was just these cement, you can see them putting on cinder blocks. I love the German policeman. This is a West Berlin policeman, kind of like watching from their side of the wall. Now they're building, this is the initial part, building up the concrete slabs. And you can see it does get pretty serious. This, you can see the Reichstag building in the background, still empty since 1933 in the fire. Even in 1960, there's nothing going on in there. It's still an empty building. Now you can see the Berlin Wall. They made the very top round so nobody could actually climb over the wall. It cut right through streets. Eventually, they tore down buildings to make the wall, the inside of the wall, even bigger. This will include the so-called death strip. They have anti-vehicles, they have trenches, and then there's guard towers that if anyone goes into this area, the East German guards will shoot at them. Now, of course, on the West Berlin side, the wall there, you could approach it, and you can see a lot of West Berliners had a lot of fun putting graffiti up along the wall. Now, today, of course, parts of the Berlin Wall have been taken down, and they've been given gifts around the world to different places. I took the photograph of this one here. This is on the USS Intrepid over in New York City. But we've also seen parts of the wall down in Charlottesville, Virginia. There's one out at the Reagan Ranch and Library out in California. We saw one there. So you can find parts of the Berlin Wall pretty much all around the world. Now, the city is divided, and it's going to be divided until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990. Here we see, this is Checkpoint Charlie. The Americans had checkpoints, between the Soviet section and the American section, and they went by, there was Checkpoint A, Checkpoint B, Checkpoint C, and of course the military has names for all those, for letters, Abel, Baker, and in this case, Charlie, so it became Checkpoint Charlie. This is the American side, you'd have to go here and check in with the guards before you got into that line there. This is up on Friedrichstrasse, and then you head into East Berlin, up the street there. This is looking at Checkpoint Charlie into the American sector. It's now since the fall of the Berlin Wall, my wife and I have been here. You can actually still visit Checkpoint Charlie, as you see. There's a McDonald's on the right, but it's changed a lot since then. Now, as you're leaving the American sector, you can see it's the wall here being built up, German children walking around it. So it is divided now, Berlin. Now, people do make attempts to escape to West Berlin. They try different things, cars with hidden chambers, and there was even one case where they tried to string a wire from one building over to another, and they would actually rappel down the wire. So there were different ways of trying to escape, and some did make it. This was actually a East German soldier who was on patrol and then decided to make a break for it. You see him running down the street. He drops his weapon, leaps over the barbed wire into West Berlin. This photograph became very famous. In fact, you can see here, they actually have a recreation of it, of the soldier jumping over the wire. Unfortunately, 136 died trying, including 18-year-old Peter Fechter. We see a picture of him here on the left, and he tried getting over the walls. He was actually shot by the East German border guards, and he was actually left there and pretty much bled to death. This was a memorial that I took a photograph of this when we were in Berlin. Of the 136, they have white crosses here to represent with the names of everyone who died trying. This is right near the Reichstag building. Now, John F. Kennedy travels to Berlin. In Berlin, in West Berlin, he's going to give his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. Ich bin ein Berliner is German for I am a Berliner. I have it here. We're going to put this on here. Let me just see if I can get this up for you. I know this is not very high tech holding up my iPad to the camera, but best I can do.
There are many people
Here we go.
in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
All right, that was the famous speech. Let me stop it here.
All free men.
Not great with technology here. All right, so that was the famous speech. Thousands had gone there to listen to him speak. Here we see a picture of Kennedy looking over the wall. This was actually a lookout point built in West Berlin, so people could go up there and wave. Because, when they built the wall, families were divided. Husband might have been at work, and when the wall went up, you could not travel in between. So husband and wife, mother, children, families were divided, and the best they could do, parents from their, married children could go and wave to them and see each other, but that's the best they could do. Here was a picture. We just showed you the video of the speech. And as I said, crowds, thousands of it. I think we have a little thing here. Let's see here. It was estimated the crowds to be around 450,000, and they were very enthusiastic about the speech. Here we see a photograph. You could see this was in a square, not far from the wall, but not too close. They, had to protect Kennedy, and they didn't want anyone, say anything to happen to him. So the speech was given a number of blocks away. Now the public square where he gave the speech was renamed John F. Kennedy Platz. There were actually streets in Berlin that was named after him also. And in the square, there's actually a plaque commemorating the speech. So if you go there today, you can see this plaque. Now we're going to talk about Cuba. Now, in 1958, the communist leader, Fidel Castro, overthrew the Cuban dictatorship. The former dictator, Fulgencio, if I'm saying that wrong, sorry, Batista, ruled Cuba as a dictator. He had very strong ties to the United States government and to the United States mob. Many of the, if everyone's ever seen the Godfather Part 2, you know that the mob had a very strong connection to Cuba. A lot of casinos and hotels in Havana. Now, when Castro takes over, he seizes all private property. This is what the communists do, including property held by U.S. corporations like AT&T, IBM, all these large corporations. So Eisenhower retaliates by cutting off all aid to Cuba. Castro then turns to the Soviet Union. Here we see him embracing Khrushchev. And he will now then turn and become an ally of the Soviet Union. Now, in April of 1961, as we mentioned earlier, CIA-trained anti-Castro Cubans invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans were trained by CIA. They actually had been members of Batista's military, his secret police, who had fled Cuba, and they were going to try to see if they could retake it over, and the CIA had trained it and given them weapons. So they land on the island, but it is a total failure. They land in the wrong place. They don't get the support they think. Kennedy realizes the whole thing is falling apart real fast, so he cuts ties to them, not to further involve America in this disastrous invasion attempt. So it's a total failure for the anti-Castro forces. Castro led actually 25,000 Cuban forces and defeated the anti-Castro forces in just 3 days. It's a major embarrassment to the Kennedy administration and to the United States. Castro at this point now becomes a hero in Cuba, and he's becoming very concerned about a U.S. invasion of Cuba. The interesting thing, the Bay of Pigs is actually, it's called that, but it's a real incorrect translation. The actual place is called Bahia de Cochinos. In Cuban Spanish, it's actually the name of a fish that lives there, but it's been retranslated to mean pigs, so it's called the Bay of Pigs, but it's actually not the correct translation. Just a little interesting side note there. Now, this will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the last thing we're going to talk about today. After the Bay of Pigs, the Soviets promise to protect Cuba. Now, U.S. Sends these U-2 spy planes. They're photographing, flying over Cuba, photographing, and then they come back one day and they find in their photographs nuclear missiles had been placed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. Here's one of the photographs showing short range and medium range nuclear weapons, missile sites in Cuba, well within the range of the United States. As you can imagine, the people in the United States military and the government are not happy at all. This is actually one of the missiles. It's actually still in Cuba today, and I guess it's some sort of monument to them. Now, it's only 90 miles off the coast of the United States, so it's a major threat to us. Now, as I said, the nuclear missiles there planted, set up in October of 1962, and it's a direct challenge to the U.S. by the Soviets. Now, Kennedy ordered the U.S. military into full alert, and actually there were preparations made that they might have to invade Cuba. Here we see Kennedy in the conference room in the White House with all his aides going over different options, what to do, because you got to understand something, that Kennedy has to get the missiles out, but he doesn't want to risk a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Now here we have pictures of him with some of his military aides going over a number of options, what they were doing. The military were advising for a full-scale either air attack or invasion of Cuba. Kennedy didn't want to do this because he was afraid this would lead to a nuclear war. So he keeps pushing back on the military, who some of them actually felt that Kennedy didn't have enough, let's say, guts to actually take on the Soviets, including this man back here. Let me just, Curtis LeMay. This guy here really had no respect whatsoever for Kennedy, and he really wanted to launch a full-scale nuclear attack on the Cubans, which Kennedy knew would have been a disaster for the United States. So, as I said, he didn't want to do this. Now, to avoid a war, Kennedy orders the U.S. Navy to put Cuba under a quarantine. In other words, we're not going to allow any ships with missiles to go to Cuba. As they said, they didn't want to take a chance on attacking and sinking a ship that was bringing medical supplies or baby food to Cuba, but they wanted to keep the missiles out. So they a quarantine. Any ship getting close, the Navy would stop and search it. All right. Here we see a picture of one of the Soviet ships with the American Air Force flying over, taking photographs. This one here, if you look closely, right here, you can see the crates with the nuclear missiles on board. Here's another Soviet ship with a, you can see up here too. Let me see. Oh, never mind. Anyway, U.S. naval ship approaching one of the Soviet ships. This was the Daily News cover, blockade of the Cuba. And people were getting very nervous, not just out in the public, but in the White House. It looked really like, and we found out later, we really were getting very close to World War III, a full nuclear war with the Soviet Union. As the chimes go off. Now, President Kennedy was careful not to call it a blockade, since that would mean that we were at war with Cuba. So they called it a quarantine because it sounds more medical than military. Now, nobody in the world knew what was going on. Even people in the United States didn't know what was going on. It just knew that we were ramping up military actions against Cuba. And the Soviets were accusing us in front of everyone that we were trying to provoke World War III, and that the Soviets hadn't done anything there. No one really knew about it. So the U.S. ambassador to the UN, a man named Adlai Stevenson, he was a top Democrat. He ran against Eisenhower twice in 1952 and 1956. Unfortunately, he lost to Eisenhower both times, unfortunately for him, that is. But Kennedy made him the ambassador to the UN. And in a meeting of the Security Council, when the Soviet Union was telling everyone that America was pushing us into war, Stevenson came up and confronted the the Soviet ambassador, and when the Soviets denied it, we brought out all those pictures our spy plane had taken, and it really kind of embarrassed the Soviet Union. Now I have a picture of film here, so let's see if we can do this.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
Court of world opinion.
Okay, that was Stevenson confronting the Soviet ambassador, and he really had nothing to say. Now the world knew it, but the question was, who is going to back down? Again, here's an actual photograph showing Stevenson there. You can see Stevenson, he's right above me. There we go. And they're showing, let's see if I can do it this way. And you can see up in this direction, let's see which way I'm pointing, they're showing the photographs. For 2 days, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were close to nuclear war. It wouldn't take much. They could have, a commander could have fired a missile, an American plane could have been shot down. And we were so close to nuclear war. Khrushchev finally backs down, and he decides he's going to pull the missiles out of Cuba. All right, and this diffuses the whole situation once he pulls it out. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said afterwards, we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. In other words, it was very close, and the Russians were the ones who pulled out. Now, the Soviets pulled the missiles out in exchange for a U.S. promise to pull missiles out of Turkey, though that was kept secret. We were planning to pull them out in 6 months, and that was kept secret from everyone. So this doesn't look good for the Soviet Union and doesn't look good for Khrushchev. So a potential World War III was averted. And both sides, we see President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev meeting here, both sides started discussions on how to reduce nuclear missiles. The enormity of how close the world came to thermonuclear war impelled Khrushchev to propose a far-reaching easing of tensions with the United States. And of course, the United States went along with it. And this is going to be the start of a number of treaties over the next 30 years that are going to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons. All right, so it's going to really ease the tensions. But 1962, it was very, very close. Now, the compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because of the removal of the missiles from Turkey was a secret, so they looked like they backed down. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was ousted from power by the Politburo, led by the new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev, we see a photograph here, was famous for being very stoic, didn't say very much. He was also famous for something else here, if you look closely. The man had the hugest eyebrows. They used to constantly make fun of those eyebrows. In fact, here we see, look, mean, I killed as many people as there are hairs on my eyebrows. Yeah, he was shown in political cartoons with these gigantic, like, caterpillars on his forehead. But anyway, Brezhnev will now be the leader of the Soviet Union right into the 1970s until his death. And we're going to see, once he dies, we're going to start to see an end of the Cold War and end of communism. But that's much in the future. Brezhnev will be here to stay. I remember when I was in college, right, sweetheart? Do you remember that too? Yep. Brezhnev? Yep. Brezhnev was in the news. The Cold War wasn't as hot as it was in 1962, but the tensions were still there, and Brezhnev was still the big leader of the Soviet Union. But we'll, again, like we said, we'll talk about him later. Now, Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later was in part because of the Soviet Politburo's embarrassment at both Khrushchev's concessions to the U.S., pulling the missiles out of Cuba, and his ineptitude in starting the crisis in the first place. It was Khrushchev's idea to put the missiles in Cuba in the first place. And I think they say the people in the high power in the Politburo were very upset that he had done this. So Khrushchev was sent to retirement. This wasn't the Stalinist days. No one put a bullet in the back of his head. That's what would have happened under Stalin. But he was allowed to retire, and he lived out his life until he died in 1971. Now, there were some in the American military that are angry at Kennedy. They were angry that Kennedy didn't order an invasion of Cuba, even if it meant starting World War III. There were some people in our military, like Curtis LeMay. I showed you his picture before. He was the American general that was in charge of the Air Force that was bombing Japan, causing all the firestorms and pretty much devastating most of Japan. LeMay was now part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was pushing for an invasion of Cuba, and he was angry afterwards that Kennedy never did this. There were some people like LeMay in the military and others some like him who felt that, and this is crazy to even say this, that a nuclear war was winnable. He would say, yes, we could get into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Yes, they could hit some of our cities. We could lose, 500,000 to millions of Americans in nuclear explosions, but we would defeat the Soviet Union and we would win the Cold War. Kennedy, like other people, realized that was kind of crazy talk, and they just didn't go along with it. All right, that ends our part on the height of the Cold War. We're going to have one more section. It's going to talk about the culture of the Cold War, the movies, and everything that came out of this whole idea of the Cold War. But that's it for now, and I hope you enjoy. Oh, there she goes. This is my HP class. You want to say hi? Come on, say hi. She's coming over to say hi. She's making dinner for me.
Not yet. Hi, guys.
There we go. All right. So, have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.